Okay, welcome back to the deep dive. So you've shared some sources with us, and, well, our job here is to really dig into them.
Yeah, pull out the important bits, the gold nuggets, as you say.
Exactly, and figure out what it all means, especially for you.
Think of us as helping you navigate the information landscape you've laid out.
And today we're doing a deep dive, looking at something pretty fundamental, how the West is starting to really rethink warfare.
Based on lessons, sometimes painful ones, coming out of the conflict in Ukraine.
It feels like a big moment of, strategic adjustment.
Definitely. Battlefield realities are forcing everyone to look again at assumptions they've held for, well, decades.
Our main source for this is a really interesting piece from The Economist. It uses a recent British defense review as a kind of lens.
Right, to look at the new thinking that's emerging, but also the, let's be honest, huge practical challenges,
Right.
funding especially.
Yeah, it lays out the ambitious ideas, but then hits you with the difficulties of actually making them happen.
So our mission, let's pull out the sharpest insights. We're talking new tech, different ways of operating, bureaucratic hurdles, and yeah, that big elephant in the room, money.
Let's get into it.
Okay, so the article kicks off with this really striking example. Ukrainian drones, right? Launching from deep inside Russia.
Hitting bombers hundreds of miles away on their airfields? Yeah, I remember reading that.
It's painted as one of those moments, a
Yeah.
real turning point in military thinking.
Kind of old school sabotage meets this new, relatively cheap drone technology.
Exactly. And from that single event, the article pulls out two really critical lessons that are reshaping how Western militaries see things now.
Okay, what's the first one?
First, how new tech, especially when it's used, cleverly, inventively, can be disproportionately lethal.
So it's not just about having the fanciest kit, but how you use maybe simpler stuff in smart ways.
Precisely. And the second lesson, maybe even bigger, it just smashes that old idea that fighting happens only at the front line.
Right. The battlefield now goes deep, deep behind what everyone assumed was safe territory.
Which totally flips the script, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It undermines assumptions Western forces have kind of relied on since the Cold War ended.
There was that long period of, well, relative quiet after the Soviet Union collapsed.
Yeah, for a quarter century, maybe more. And frankly, some militaries, the article mentions the UK's Royal Air Force specifically actually brought forces together onto fewer, bigger
To
bases.
save money, presumably.
Yeah, consolidation for efficiency.
But looking back now, especially with that drone raid example, that seems incredibly vulnerable.
It does. And the article points out the British Review is pretty blunt about acknowledging that mistake. It gets credit for that.
So the review understands these 2 points. The power of new tech and the danger to the rear.
Yes. It praises the review for getting both. It argues the RAF, for instance, has to basically relearn how to operate from lots of different places. Dispersal.
Spreading out fuel, weapons, spare parts.
All the critical stuff. So you don't have one big, juicy target.
Makes sense. Instead of putting all your eggs in one basket that an enemy can just take out, it's just sort of back to basics resilience.
And the article stresses this isn't just about air bases. This need for resilience, for redundancy, it applies much more widely.
Like what? Critical infrastructure.
Exactly. Undersea cables, power grids, communication networks. All of a sudden, they're potentially part of the battlefield too.
Which leads to another big idea in the source, right? This whole of society thing.
Yeah, the British Review really pushes this, the need for a whole of society approach to defense and resilience.
Okay, let's unpack whole of society. What does that actually look like?
Well, the review, and the article quotes it, calls for everyone, industry, finance, universities, schools, even, ordinary people to be better prepared for crises.
So defense isn't just the military's job anymore. If the power grid is a target, society itself needs to be tougher.
That's the idea. It's a huge cultural shift, really, moving beyond just thinking about soldiers and kit.
Feels like a massive organizational challenge, too.
Oh, absolutely. And the way militaries handle technology, that needs a shakeup, too. The review warns that new tech is changing warfare more profoundly than, ever before in history.
Wow. Okay, but here's the catch, the source points out. Britain and its allies have been, well, pretty slow at actually bringing in this new tech.
Yeah, it gives this statistic that's kind of staggering. For big defense projects, over £20 million, getting a contract signed takes, on average, 6.5 years.
6.5 years. In tech terms, that's ancient history. You're ordering stuff that's almost obsolete by the time it arrives.
It's glacial, right? Especially when innovations are happening at breakneck speed, as the article puts it. It really shows the bureaucratic inertia they're up against.
So how does the review suggest fixing that, injecting some speed?
It recommends setting aside 10% of the yearly procurement budget just for novel technologies, ring-fencing it.
Trying to create like a fast lane for innovation.
Yeah, a dedicated pathway. And it's not just buying new gadgets faster. It's about changing the structure of the forces to use them differently.
Okay, tell me more about that vision. What does the article say?
Well, he talks about plans like the Royal Navy aiming for a hybrid carrier air wing.
Hybrid, meaning?
Mixing their top-end F-35 jets with drones, some sophisticated, some simpler, cheaper ones.
Blending the high-tech with, like, mass and persistence from uncrewed systems.
Exactly. And the Army has this target structure, too, a 20-40-40 mix for its equipment.
20-40-40. Okay, break that down for me. Sounds pretty different.
It is quite radical. Only 20% would be traditional crewed platforms, tanks, armored vehicles, the usual stuff.
Okay, just 20%. What's the other 80%?
Fun crewed systems. 40% would be reusable drones and robots, and the other 40%, they call them consumables.
Consumables, like disposable, single-use things.
Pretty much. Think cheap drones, loitering munitions, the kamikaze type, plus large stocks of shells, missiles, stuff you expect to use up.
So the idea is swamping the enemy with huge numbers of affordable, maybe even throwaway systems.
Controlled by that smaller 20% core of sophisticated, crewed platforms. It directly reflects those lessons about massed, cheap drone attacks we've seen in Ukraine.
Interesting. Leaning into quantity and affordability, but still needing that human core. What's fascinating is they're not just chucking out the old stuff.
No, the source is clear on that. This isn't the end of the tank or the warship.
So it's not just drones and trucks, like the article quips.
Right. The review apparently still sees traditional platforms, like tanks, as vital, partly for protecting troops, because surveillance tech makes the battlefield so transparent and dangerous now.
And things like nuclear subs are still hugely important, even if they cost a fortune.
Absolutely. It's all about finding the right mix, the right balance between the old and the new.
Okay, so these strategic ideas, learning from Ukraine, embracing tech, dispersal, societal resilience, fixing procurement, changing force structure, they sound pretty solid on paper.
They do. The article suggests they're, laudable, a good direction.
I sense a but coming. There usually is, isn't there?
There is indeed, and this is where the article really pivots. It talks about the glaring gap between ambition and money.
The classic defense planning problem. So what's the deal with the funding? Can they actually afford to do all this?
Well, Britain plans to raise defense spending to 2.5% of GDP by 2027. And there's a sort of vague goal of hitting 3% by 2034.
On the article's take on that.
Bluntly, grossly inadequate. Not nearly enough to meet the threats they're facing or to pay for these new strategies.
Why is 2.5% or even 3% seen as so insufficient then?
Well, look at the context. Russia is rearming fast, and maybe more critically, the U.S. is signaling it might shift its military focus, its resources, away from Europe, more towards the Pacific.
Right, so Europe might have to pick up more slack.
Exactly. And the article contrasts Britain's target with Germany, facing similar threats, which could apparently be spending double Britain's amount by 2029.
Wow, double. What are other NATO allies thinking? Does it mention that?
It does. It suggests NATO allies are likely to agree on a target of maybe 3.5% of GDP on defense soon, perhaps at an upcoming summit.
3.5%. That's a big jump from the old 2% target. Yeah. And way higher than Britain's plan.
It is. And the article admits getting their 3.5% or more means tough choices. Painful tax rises, welfare cuts, or borrowing. Difficult politics.
But the conclusion is
that it's hard to see how European nations can realistically support Ukraine, properly deter Russia, and cover for any U.S. shift without spending significantly more, closer to that 3.5% level, maybe.
It also brings up history, doesn't it? A bit of a warning.
Yeah, it reminds us that back in 2014, NATO allies agreed to aim for 2% defense spending.
And then most of them didn't actually hit it for years.
Exactly. So just saying a target number doesn't mean much if you don't actually reach it. And the article stresses the timing is critical too.
Saying there's little point in deferring spending to the 2030s.
Because the threat is here and now, and it's evolving rapidly.
And didn't the British Review itself say something about war being unthinkable until recently?
Yes. It quotes the review saying that until recently, a major war seemed unthinkable, but now warns conflict would be deadly and long-lasting. That urgency really underlines the article's point about the funding gap.
So it paints this picture. Clear strategic lessons learned, necessary changes identified.
The tech shifts, the need for resilience, fixing procurement.
But all these ambitious plans just hit a wall. Not enough money allocated.
Right. The ambition crashes into the reality of the budget.
And it's not just the amount, but the political will to actually find that money, especially given the scale of the threats the article describes.
Recognizing the problem is one thing. Paying to fix it quickly enough seems like the much bigger challenge.
It really highlights that adapting isn't just about technology or organization. It's about making some really tough national investment choices.
Yeah, it's about how societies decide to react and invest when faced with these, well, pretty urgent new realities.
Okay, let's quickly pull together the main threads from this source then. First, those key lessons from Ukraine, the impact of new tech, especially drones, and this idea of the deep battle, way behind the lines.
Which drives the need for dispersal, spreading forces out, and this wider whole of society resilience idea.
Then you've got the huge challenges in actually changing military structures, integrating new, often cheaper tech alongside the old expensive stuff, and fixing those painfully slow procurement systems.
Definitely. And running underneath all of it, that big funding gap. The plans are there, the ambition is stated, but the money allocated, according to the source, just doesn't match up, especially compared to the threats and what allies might be doing.
So connecting this back to you, our listener, really getting your head around these strategic shifts, the arguments about how militaries need to change, and especially this whole debate about defense funding, it's crucial.
Yeah, because it shapes everything: security, economic choices, how prepared we are, not just for the military, but for everyone.
It really lays bare the scale of change and investment these Western nations feel they need to make.
Or at least say they need to make.
Right. And that leads us to a final thought for you to consider, something that really comes out of this source material. The article highlights that, yes, the review recognizes the need for fast adaptation and more spending. But turning that recognition into reality, that faces huge hurdles, just like hitting those old 2% spending targets proved so hard for so long.
And it also hammers home that deterring war is far, far better than actually fighting one.
So bearing that in mind, the huge scale of these proposed changes, the massive costs involved, what do you think it really takes for a whole society, not just the armed forces, but everyone, to effectively deter conflict in this, well, challenging new era we seem to be entering?
That's a big question, with some pretty profound implications for the years ahead.
Indeed it is. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into rethinking warfare. We hope this gave you a clearer, maybe more impactful understanding of these critical debates based on the source you shared with us.